Yeah, I almost forgot about your 5 minutes, Mr. Weston. You have 5 minutes for opening remarks. I was going to turn it right over to my colleagues who I know are eager to want to ask questions, but we'll allow 5 minutes for you for opening remarks. And again, thank you for being back before the committee. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. So hello and bonjour, Chair and Committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you again and to discuss the steps that Loblaws is taking to help Canadians. While it appears that the peak of inflation is behind us, we know that increased food prices still have a real impact on Canadians as they try to put meals on the table while balancing their budgets. And we know that that's harder today when almost everything has rapidly increased in price, including housing, heating, and fuel, leaving less income for essentials like food. It's an appalling statistic that almost 80% more Canadians turned to food banks this year compared with 2019. We all need to do more to help. And this is a responsibility that we take very seriously and one that Loblaws' entire team continues to work on. Over the last 2 months, we've been an active participant in discussions with government, sharing ideas and providing details about our specific actions. We outlined our recent letter to the committee. As we outlined in our recent letter to the committee, we focused our efforts on delivering additional value across a basket of 35 items and categories that matter most to customers, like milk, butter, eggs, and chicken, where we are meaningfully lowering prices. These critical items are present in almost every grocery basket and make up nearly 10% of our sales. We're delivering these savings through the pricing and promotional programs that customers understand and respond best to. They are making a difference. Let me give you an actual example. On a product like chicken drumsticks, the cost to us has risen by 30% since 2019, but the investments that we're making in lowering prices means that the average price for this product over the last 12 weeks has been 4% lower than 4 years ago. This is on top of super low everyday pricing in our discount stores, where we routinely sell products like bananas, sugar, and milk, all below cost. We compete every day with other major grocery chains, global multinationals like Walmart and Costco, regional chains, local independents, and online companies like Amazon. Canada is an extremely competitive grocery market. We know if we do not provide real value, customers will and do shop elsewhere. Since the beginning of September, we've saved customers even more money through our PC Optimum points and members-only pricing, and through programs like retro pricing at No Frills and the Maxi Merci campaign in Quebec that has served more than 2.2 million people. We're also the only national grocer that offers price match in all of our discount stores. Each year, more than 10 million customers take advantage of this program, and in just 2 months, we matched competitors' offers to the tune of $38 million. Finally, in addition to those immediate steps, we are changing the way we invest in communities by opening more discount stores in more markets. By the end of next year, we will have added nearly 70 new or converted discount stores, reaching an additional 2 million Canadians with the best combination of quality and value available in the country, on average 20% cheaper than a non-discount store. These efforts are making an impact. We watch closely the prices in our stores and inflation levels at our checkout. Compared to the StatsCan food CPI of 5.4 in October of 2023, our internal inflation number is 5.1%. And when we look at products that are actually purchased in our stores, our internal inflation today is already below the overall CPI. We are doing our part to help stabilize food prices for our customers. But as we've stated time and time again, we cannot do this alone. Recent studies from the Bank of Canada and the Competition Bureau have proven that grocery stores are not the reason for high food prices. And as such, we are unable to unilaterally resolve the inflationary pressures. As I explained to this committee earlier this year, for every $25 in groceries sold, we earn just $1 in profit. That means that even if this industry had zero profits, a $25 grocery bill would still cost $24. It's important to stress that the suppliers, who make up 70 to 80% of the price of products, remain largely absent from this effort. And unfortunately, we have not yet seen a manufacturer come forward with a proposal to decrease cost. And in fact, many of them are already signaling or submitting higher than expected cost increases for next year. There is some good news. Food prices are definitely stabilizing, and we expect that to continue. But we are concerned that the Grocery Code of Conduct could slow down this momentum. When I was here with you 6 months ago, I voiced my support for a fair, balanced, and reciprocal code. I also cautioned that a one-sided code that removes a retailer's ability to hold vendors accountable to their commitments would risk higher prices. And while the principles of the code as it's currently set up are sound, when you get into the details, there is significant risk of higher prices and empty shelves. Now, there's clearly a lot of passion around this subject, so to inform this discussion, we have provided the committee members with the latest copy of the code and the details of our concerns. But I would like to share one specific example. The current drafting of the dispute resolution principle in the code gives manufacturers the ability to escalate disputes around cost increases to a yet-to-be-defined third-party mechanism. In Australia, that third-party mechanism has supported increases in costs in essentially 100% of cases. If that had happened in Canada, since the beginning of last year, it would have resulted in $750 million in additional inflation pressure for consumers. That risk is very real, and on its own is a reason for pause. There are 3 other specific areas of risk in the code, including Section 2.5, 3.4, and 4.4. And we've laid them out for this committee in the material provided. I'm happy to offer a more detailed perspective on any of them, but in our judgment, each one increases the likelihood of higher retail prices or less product on the shelves, directly or indirectly. I must say I'm perplexed as to why other industry leaders are making such confident claims about the code's ability to stabilize prices, when it was never intended to do so. The conversations about the code began years before inflation actually took hold. A variation of this code did not help stabilize prices in the UK, in Australia, or Ireland over the last 2 years, where none of which have lower food price inflation than Canada. I'm worried that amidst our collective enthusiasm to deliver meaningful relief for Canadians on the cost of food, we are traveling in hope towards something that will do exactly the opposite simply because it sounds good. So I would urge this committee to look closely at the details. We completely agree that there is an opportunity to improve the way that retailers and manufacturers work together, and that there are certain things we can do differently ourselves. We are taking action on this front already. A few weeks ago, we announced our new small supplier program, delivering concrete benefits to over 1,000 manufacturers to reduce the cost and risk of doing business with us. Either way, we will do more. We absolutely remain open to the right version of the code, but we simply must not do it at the expense of our customers. Loblaws' purpose is to help Canadians live life well. We'll always be ready to do our part and come to the table for these conversations, and we will stand up for customers even if it is unpopular. We welcome the committee's continued interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weston. We'll turn now to questions. I have Ms. Rood first for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Weston, for being here today. Mr. Weston, you just noted that the code doesn't affect the numbers for consumers, but there's a report that came out today that would say otherwise. And I'm just wondering if you could tell this committee, as you know, I've been a big proponent of this code from the beginning because I believe that it's going to help not only consumers but suppliers to have lower prices and be able to pass those lower prices on to consumers. So could you tell this committee why you won't sign the code and what needs to be done to get you to sign the code? Yes, please.
So we absolutely will sign the code. We've always said that we would sign the code. We just need to sign a code that doesn't increase the risk of higher food prices to Canadians. And as the code is currently drafted, our strong conviction is that it will do so. As I mentioned before, the code was set up, with the intent of improving the relationship between manufacturers and retailers. It was never designed, to lower food prices, and we're in a very different circumstance right now, where there are food prices that are increasing, have been increasing across the board. This idea that grocers are the problem, I think, is part of what is shifted the dialogue into somewhat the wrong place. I've got a list here of manufacturers, all of whom have claimed that price increases have been the driver of their excellent performance over the last 12 months. That includes Pepsi in their quarterly results, Nestle in their quarterly results, Kraft Heinz in their quarterly results, Procter & Gamble, the list goes on. These are large multinational manufacturers, and the Code of Conduct has a set of clauses in it that reduce the grocer's ability to negotiate hard against those vendors. We were able to push back on 18% of what we believed we considered to be unjustified cost increases across the industry last year. Based on the way the code is drafted today, we will be severely restricted in terms of our ability to do that. It's very plain to see in that circumstance specifically that will lead to higher cost increases from manufacturers, and that will lead to higher prices for consumers.
Thank you. I'm just curious why Loblaw has a problem with the section of the code that deals with the need to get reliable food to our independent grocers and people who live in rural and remote communities in particular.
We don't have a problem with any aspect of the code that that suggests that whatsoever. One of the other examples, in the code is something that we charge a compliance charge for manufacturers if they fail to deliver to our stores the products that they agreed to deliver. And the way to think about that is that we will develop up an ad, a promotion. Let's say we're going to put an item on for a 30% discount. And we agree with the manufacturer that they will provide the forecasted amount of products for that ad. And if they are unable to deliver that quantity, which we are planning for to benefit customers, then there's a compliance charge for that failure to deliver. And if we take away the ability to hold that vendor accountable, then what we're concerned about is that the customer or that the manufacturer will not give us 100% of the committed order. And as a result, we will disappoint the customer because we won't have enough product for them in the store in that given week at that price. And the next time, we won't be able to put it on such an aggressive price because we'll be afraid of running out. That's another very tangible example of how the way the code is drafted, the principle is fine. The way it's drafted is the issue that we have concerns about.
Thank you. Sorry, I know time is running short. Mr. Weston, the produce industry has the DRC, and you are a member of the produce of that. And the dispute resolution model being discussed is similar to the DRC system with education as a first step. So why does this not work for you, but not in it works for you, but not in the code model?
It hasn't been finalized, the drafting of this in the code. It's just an open, couple of sentences. And as I've mentioned before, multiple times, Australia, the UK, Ireland have been, quoted as sort of the models that we're trying to replicate with that dispute resolution system. And in Australia, as an example, it is woefully inadequate, based on our research and our understanding of the way it works. So again, to be clear, we're not saying no, we're not saying we don't want to sign the code. We're simply pointing out that right now there are 4 areas where the drafting is not specific enough or it's framed in such a way that it's going to put the customer at risk. And I don't think any of us should be taking those kind of risks at this point. We've got an opportunity to get this code right. Let's make sure that we take the time to do it.
What specific recommendations did you ask the Liberal government to initiate when you were here in Ottawa a couple weeks back, and have any of those recommendations been acted upon?
Yeah, I do. So a number of recommendations. Number one was to review front-of-pack labeling requirements. There is a significant incremental cost every time you have to change a packaging plate, ingredients or nutritional labeling and that sort of thing. We think there's an opportunity to use digital QR codes as an alternative so that instead of changing the packaging every time, we just have to update the information on the QR code. Right now, the front-of-pack labeling requirements are not going that way. That's a meaningful incremental cost. We've suggested a pause on the P2 plastic proposal to reconsider the cost impact of that proposal to Canadians. We lead the way in Canada when it comes to plastic packaging reduction. We're very bullish on the technological solutions that are ultimately going to be available, to solve some of these problems. But right now, they don't exist. And I've seen numbers, astonishing numbers, that suggest that the P2 proposal could add as much as $6 billion of incremental cost to the value chain. So we've really got to think carefully about accelerating that one until we know that we have solutions that the industry can properly take on board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weston. Thank you, Ms. Rood. We'll now turn to Mr. Drouin online for up to 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witness for being here today for the second time in less than a year. Mr. Weston, Loblaws participated in the drafting of the Code of Conduct. Is that correct?
So we've been participants in the process. We were not on the working committee.
D'accord. Et donc vous avez participé.
So you participated in some way. I'm just having difficulty with something, and other colleagues echoed this. All of the parties that are here, so Conservatives, the Bloc, the NDP, the Liberal Party, we all agree that there should be a grocery store code of conduct. I don't understand Walmart's and Loblaws' strategy. At the 11th hour, at 11:59, right before midnight, there seems to be pressure on other colleagues. There are three other retailers who have absolutely no issue with the problems you mentioned. Why are you raising those now? And how come the other retailers don't seem to have the same issues? Do you think that they've interpreted this differently?
So the most important thing, and I think the thing that we're all here to discuss, certainly the purpose of this session, is what can we do to lower the cost burden, on Canadians, especially when they are, shopping at the grocery store. As I've said before, the Code of Conduct, is not specifically designed to do that. So we're trying to force fit the code, into a different outcome. And we have been participating in this process. We have been giving feedback on this process. We have shared the four, points of concern multiple times over the last 18 months. The idea that we've dropped this on, the process at the last minute is completely untrue. I shared it specifically, in terms in my remarks here 6 months ago. We provided the same very strongly worded perspective, in our meetings with the Ministry of Industry in October, and and it's falling on deaf ears. We're getting no response. We're being told no, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. And so, in the last couple of weeks, we have had to take a firmer position. We are here being held accountable for high food prices that are not the direct responsibility of the grocery industry. And now you're asking us to sign on to something that we believe in our bones is going to do the opposite of what other people say that it's going to do. And they won't even talk to us about it anymore.
Je comprends très bien.
I do understand, but here's the issue. Your perspective is not the one adopted by the 5 major retailers in Canada, and they have 80% of the market. It would be something else if they were all unanimous in your and agreed with your opinion, but it's not the case. So 3 other retailers say that they disagree with your position. It's 3 against 2. So you understand that we have certain doubts and we're concerned about the perspective you're presenting. I also understand that there are processors who also have a big share of the market, but that's why the code of conduct is important, because it would make things a bit more balanced for small retailers, and you'd be able to be on the same level playing field. What you're presenting, my fear is that other provinces will just go ahead with their own code of conduct. Is Loblaws ready to operate in an environment with various regulatory codes that vary between different provinces?
Look, the best outcome, without question here is a code that we can all sign on to. There are some other retailers who are clearly enthusiastic supporters of the code. I'm not sure if they have spent time, in the detail of the drafting or not, because it is perplexing, to us that they are as enthusiastic about the fact that this code, they think that this code is going to reduce prices. It may have to do with the fact that they are not as well developed in the discount retail space as we are, as Walmart is, and as, for example, Costco is. Discount stores depend on their ability to drive a hard bargain with their manufacturing counterparts. And yes, we have to do our absolute best to support small and medium-sized manufacturers and growers in this country. That's what our small supplier program is concrete action of actually doing. The thing about this code is it's enabling the largest multinationals in the world, who are 10 times larger than Loblaw on its own, to it's a position where we're not able to negotiate as firmly against unjustifiable cost increases. So yes, we are. This code will and should, help with small manufacturers and growers. But at the same time, it's going to unlock and empower, the largest multinational manufacturers in the world, who are already standing in the way of lower food prices for Canadians. That is a real challenge. As I said before, the code may sound good, but if you don't look into the detail, then we are going to end up in the opposite place of what this code intends to do.
Thank you, Mr. Drouin. Thank you, Mr. Weston. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent pour 6 minutes.
On to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Weston, for being here today. I've been listening to you from the beginning, but I'm having a hard time following what you're saying. You're saying that this code cannot work. You have some doubts, but you're not represented at the working group. How can you be here and say that you participate in the process when you're not even on the steering committee? If you were, would you be able to propose the changes that you want? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So I think the key focus here is to figure out ways to reduce the impact of inflation on Canadians. As I've said before, the way the code is currently drafted, it certainly doesn't do that. The way it was set up is we were prohibited from being, participants in the steering committee. I'm not exactly sure.
Respectfully, my time is short. How can you justify questioning the negotiation of the code of conduct, given that the majority of retailers are negotiating in good faith when you are not even at the table? Now you're saying that we need to lower prices for consumers. Of course, I agree with that. But why aren't you at the table? Why aren't you involved in the discussions and negotiations and haven't been from the beginning?
So we've been providing our feedback, but we were excluded, from the working group. We did not participate in the working group. We did have the opportunity of consultation. We provided our perspective over and over again through these consultations. And by the way, we're the first people to actually publish the language of the code, for this committee to look at and for others to look at. Previously, I don't know what evidence was provided by the advocates for the code on how it was going to lower food prices. I don't think they presented any. We're trying very hard to present very very simple, very clear evidence, that there is substantial risk here. And this feedback, was not listened to in this process.
Monsieur Weston, là, vous me dites que
Mr. Weston, you're saying that you were excluded from the working group. What I've received as information is that you just weren't there. Who excluded you? Who did that? The Canadian Council of Retailers didn't do that, surely, because Sobeys, Metro, and the Independent Grocers Association are at the table. You were sabotaging, from what I understand, a process in which you haven't even participated fully from the beginning. As Mr. Drouin said, you are going to provoke the implementation of more complex and complicated regulation. Who excluded you from the working group?
It was the way that the process was set up. Was that Sobeys and Metro would be the representatives of the industry on the working group, and that's fine. We've been trying to provide feedback all the way through, of our concerns, and we're continuing to provide that feedback.
vous me dites Sobeys et Metro sont vos...
You're saying that Sobeys and Metro are representing you at the working group, but Metro agrees. So if they're your representatives, then how come they're in agreement? Something doesn't add up. I don't understand. There's just something that does not add up in what you're saying. Earlier, you mentioned that it's important for you to keep your ability to impose fees on producers. This is one of the factors that explains that there are negotiations for this code. I don't want to disrespect you, Mr. Weston, but here's what I'm hearing. Well, have you ever been at that table in good faith and participated, or are you intending on keeping the practices that you've had for years now?
So we continue and have been throughout this process engaged and active in good faith. We were not on the working committee, but as I said, we have been providing our feedback and our perspective all along. We have senior executives who have been participating in this process. The point that I'm simply making is that our feedback is not being heard. And that is troubling for us. Maybe Sobeys and Metro operate their businesses in a different way. I know that they have fewer discount stores, so they may not be as focused on, on the lowest possible prices for Canadians, as we are. But let me give you, if I may, just a brief explanation of how these compliance charges work. The way they work is that we set an expectation that we're going to receive a certain amount of product at a certain time in a certain way, and there is a charge for that. 60% of the time we make exceptions to those charges based on good faith conversations with our manufacturers.
Monsieur Weston, ces processus-là, je les comprends bien.
I understand those mechanisms. That's what we want to regulate with the code. You're saying that the code of conduct didn't limit inflation in Australia or in the UK in recent months, and that there's still been inflation in recent months. When the codes of conduct were introduced in those countries, there was actually very positive impacts on grocery store prices. So that can't be denied. We strongly believe that a grocery store code of conduct in Canada would be good for consumers. What are your thoughts?
So, as I said before, the most important thing here is that we don't do the opposite of the intention of this committee, which is put in place, conditions that lead to higher prices from the largest multinational manufacturers in the world. So, it's important to separate that risk, from how do we effectively support Canadian growers and manufacturers. And this is one of the elements that hasn't been effectively addressed, in the code today. So, and so we have put very constructive solutions forward. At each point in this, we're not saying no. We're saying, look, there are some important adjustments and tweaks that could be made to this code that we believe offer the best of both worlds. And I'd be happy to give you examples of that, at some other point. We have heard nothing, from our counterparts in this conversation about any accommodation for these risks. They just say, no, they're not real. But they are real. And there is, I don't know where, with all due respect,
Mr. Weston, I apologize. I wanted to give you a little bit of time, but I have to make sure I'm managing the time for my colleagues. So I gave you a few extra seconds, but I got to go to Mr. McGregor now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Weston. Deputy Prime Minister Freeland and Industry Minister Champagne, they had said that all the CEOs had agreed to stabilize food prices after the meeting in September. But following that, Metro CEO Eric Laflèche said that it did absolutely nothing to change prices. So we have conflicting accounts, and I want to know from you, who is telling the truth? Is it Metro or the Liberal government?
I can't speak to Metro's perspective. I know that
it makes that statement that it did absolutely nothing. Are you in agreement with that, or with the Liberal government's contention?
In our case, that meeting resulted in materially lower prices in the 35 items and categories, that we communicated here to this committee. But it's important also to note, and I think the message that Eric was perhaps trying to communicate is that we have been making collective efforts as an industry for months and months and months, we don't want this to turn into, well, the only reason food prices are lower is because...
I don't want to dwell too much. I just wanted to get an initial answer to that first question. Now, you are the former CEO responsible for Loblaws. You've changed positions, but we do live in a country where we have 7 million Canadians, a record number, having to access food banks due to high grocery prices. What do you say to that astounding figure, and do you know how many of them might be Loblaws employees?
It's any way you look at it, the affordability challenges faced, in this country, whether it's food, gas, electricity bills, or mortgage prices. There is enormous pressure on Canadians, and 7 million, 2 million, 4 million. It's all too many people.
But do you know how many of your employees are having to access food banks?
I don't know specifically how many employees access food banks, but I'm sure it is a material number.
Okay. I think why this is such an emotional issue is because your stores sell the necessities of life, whether it's food, drink, or medicines. And you talked about the fact that you expect food prices to stabilize over the next year, but we just got a report saying that in 2024 they expect the annual cost for a family of four to go up to over $16,000, which is a $700 increase. So a lot of families, I think, in my region would look at that and say, well, that's not really stabilization. So they look at that. That's the reality for their life. And in your last quarter, you posted, the Q3, you posted a $621 million profit. The same quarter of the year before, $556 million. So now you've come to this committee, you've explained, your position on food price inflation. But when people in my riding are going through these incredible challenges, food prices are expected to go up again next year. It seems like ordinary Canadians are shouldering all of the hurt and all of the struggle, while corporations like yours, in the midst of all of this pain and struggle, are still posting record profits. Now, you may argue it's not coming from food, but you're still taking money from Canadians in other areas, and that's leaving them probably less to spend on food elsewhere.
So this is an important point, because as a grocery store business, as any private enterprise, our goal is to grow our business. It's to increase the number of customers. It's to invest in communities, to build more stores, to increase the amount of sales. And if we can increase the amount of sales, then the profit of the enterprise goes up. So there should be record profits in a way with a successful company every year, year after year. That is not an indication of bad practice. It's not an indication of some sort of profiteering. It's just an indication of a business operating exactly the way that it should. And when you think about a grocery industry at 3% of the total value of a grocery basket being profit, that's the smallest number in the large industries across Canada. So there's no evidence at all of profiteering or excess. But I do understand that Canadians are feeling this pressure. And they look at these big numbers and they think to themselves, gosh, if that company would not make so much profit, our food prices would go down.
Thank you, Mr.
But that's
Weston.
not the way that it would actually work.
I have limited time, and I want to get one more question. I think it's fair in these times when so many are struggling, including many employees in your stores, to talk about executive compensation, because the gulf between what top executives earn and what employees earn has turned into a chasm, frankly. Now, your total compensation in 2022 was $11.7 million, which was nearly a $1.1 million increase from the previous years. I was wondering if you could explain to Canadians and probably to your employees why you make 431 times more than your average employee. Because, you know, I have a quote from Unifor. The local at one of your stores said, quote, "Loblaw workers are fed up with the out-of-control disparity between their wages, the company's enormous profits, and the high cost of living. You know it's bad when workers at Canada's largest grocery store are struggling to afford their own food, even at discount stores like No Frills." How do you respond to that, Mr. Weston?
Well, first of all, I am extremely empathetic to the circumstances that Canadians face who are struggling to put food on their tables, and all of the cost pressures that they're experiencing are contributing to that. And so that's why we're focused as an enterprise on finding ways to lower prices. In the last 12 weeks alone, we've invested $438 million in lower prices. As I mentioned, many of those prices are lower than they were, 4 years ago. I get that my compensation is a big number, it certainly, it's a big number, and I understand that completely. It's reasonable in the context of other executive pay.
431 times your average employee is reasonable?
Mr. McGregor, you're at time, so I appreciate it. In fact, I gave you a few extra seconds. We'll go to Mr. Epp now for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Weston, for being here. I'm going to parse a bit your statement around support for the code or the effect of the code. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that the existence of a code does not lower grocery prices. Would you agree that the existence of a code would lower relative prices in the absence of a code, as has been the experience in the UK, Ireland, Australia?
Could you maybe just clarify what you mean by relative prices?
The prices that they would have prices would be lower than they would have been otherwise, given other external factors.
No, I don't believe that's the case, and there is no evidence that I have seen, nor that we've been able to get hold of in the UK, in Australia, or in Ireland that suggests there's a relationship between the code of conducts that were implemented in those countries and materially lower prices.
And you've been on the record of saying that the implementation of a code, as you now understand it, would add $1 billion to the cost of food.
I think there is a risk that it could add, well, I gave you a specific example of how it could add $750 million, to the cost of food, and that's inside our enterprise alone. So $1 billion is a broad and meaningful number. It's certainly not too high.
I've been in business myself. I have no issue with profit. Your concern is your relationship with some of the big manufacturers, your profit margins, and again, I have no issue with profit. The discussion might be around how much, 32.3% versus 30.7% gross margin increase over the pandemic. So be it. If the goal here is to stabilize grocery prices, it must come from a relative adjustment of profits or an address of the costs in the system. What are the costs in the system? And I guess I'm going to go back to that 32.3%, the fines and fees that your suppliers have had to pay. Is that included in that gross margin? Or is it accounted for elsewhere in the margins in your distribution centers?
I don't know precisely the answer of where it's accounted for. I can tell you this, though. As I've said before, when we have compliance charges built into the business, they're based on a very specific, set of criteria. We make exceptions, to those criteria more often, than the other way around. And those compliance charges have decreased by nearly 50% over the last 24 months.
You would not charge a compliance fee where you've asked for a pre-order of 1,000 units, then upped it to 5,000,
No.
and then a short delivery. So that is categorically, there will be no compliance charges in that situation.
Categorically, no compliance charges. At least that's what has been the way it's been explained to me.
As has been requested of other CEOs, would you table Loblaws, fines, and fees collected with this committee? During the past period.
I don't know. I don't know.
Others have committed to do so.
Yes.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Again, going back to how do we address prices, I mean, profits, relative profits is one matter. The costs in the system is what I'm hearing you say, and I think that's what we're all looking for is where can we do that. Other costs in the system, you operate distribution networks. Carbon tax is obviously one of those areas. Do you have an estimate of what your costs to the carbon tax would be?
No, we don't, and part of the reason for that is that we don't pay, the carbon tax based on where we are in the value chain, in terms of, any impact on food. So I can't speak with any, real knowledge about that subject. Although I've no doubt that anything that increases the cost, puts cost pressure in the system, is something that we should be looking at.
Who does pay the carbon tax then?
So the carbon tax is paid by emitters, as I understand it, throughout the system. And if you are an emitter, you have to pay a carbon tax.
So if that carbon tax was not in the system, that would not lower costs to consumers?
I don't know how it would work, but certainly, we have a global challenge, when it comes to carbon emissions, and so we have to balance, the present in terms of economic development and affordability, and also tackling this global challenge.
So it is that carbon tax is charged throughout the entire system right now, other than the direct fuel used on the farm. So who eats that on the way up if we're supposed to not pass that along to consumers?
I can't speak to that. I think everybody has an opportunity to get more efficient, look for ways to do that. And certainly in our case, we're trying to lower prices, and reduce the amount of energy that we consume in the enterprise.
Thank you, Mr. Epp, and thank you, Mr. Weston. You will still have 5 more minutes, so you can continue that line of questioning if you'd like. Mr. Carr, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Weston. As best as possible, if you could try to answer with a yes or no mindset, that would be greatly appreciated. My first question is, do you believe that if you sign a grocery code of conduct that your personal profit margin will decrease, yes or no?
I don't know. Our focus, entirely has been on, is this going to improve, the cost of groceries, or is it likely to increase the cost of groceries? And I think you understand how we see it.
Are you concerned that your personal profit margin may decrease if a code of conduct is signed?
No.
I note that in the financials from Loblaw that were made public recently, $1.3 billion on stock buybacks occurred. Now, it's well known that stock buybacks are a way in which investors and executives have the ability to drive up their own shares and the value of those shares. Do you believe it would be reasonable, therefore, with the profit that you and colleagues have generated by virtue of stock buybacks, to pass those savings on to consumers? Or do you believe that it is reasonable, as per Mr. McGregor's question, that as your personal profit margin continues to increase, that is simply reasonable, I believe was the word you used, or justified within the context of your overall profit?
Thank you for the question. Loblaw reinvests over 100% of its earnings back in this country in capital. New stores, new infrastructure, the jobs are not capital. So when we look at it, we are investing substantially more, back in the country than we are taking out. That's a good benchmark, for whether, our capital allocation strategy is balanced or imbalanced. And, we will continue to invest more in this country because we see significant opportunity, here for us to do so. Do you believe that the expectations that Canadians have placed on you,
according to a poll released by Abacus this morning, roughly 75% supportive of a code of conduct is unfair. So I'll repeat the question. Do you believe that the expectations that Canadians have of you, 75% of them, are unfair?
I think the expectation that Canadians have on us and on the value chain in food collectively is to find ways to lower food prices, and I think that's an entirely reasonable expectation. And our only concern with the Code of Conduct is the way that it's currently drafted creates risk of the opposite happening. That is something I think everybody should be very concerned about. And all we're asking for is a really good, honest look at this. And that's why we provided the material to this committee today, so that you would have it in front of you and you could look at it yourselves and understand that what we're saying, is true and it is a reasonable risk. We will sign a code that doesn't, raise the cost of groceries for consumers.
You said earlier in your opening remark, or perhaps it was in response to one of the primary questions at the beginning, that the deal was one-sided, the current grocery code of conduct as presented. How could it be characterized as one-sided if 3 of your main competitors believe that they are in a position to move forward with it as is?
So the way the code is drafted, and this is in section 2.5, manufacturers are not required to enter into written agreements with retailers setting out the commercial terms of their relationship. They don't have to do that. And despite this, we do. We have to enter into a contract, which is this code of conduct. That is in itself one-sided and imbalanced. These are the kinds of things that we just want this code to adjust for. Okay. Everybody should be required to enter into an agreement and be held accountable for the terms of that agreement. How
Mr.
can
Weston,
you write a contract that way?
That's satisfactory. I'd like to get one more question in, please. And that is, can you speak to the role that climate change is having on the cost of food, specifically when there are floods, droughts, other changes that are apparent in the climate, how that is impacting cost of groceries and therefore what you believe you have to pass on to consumers as a result?
So we are at time. Mr. Weston, if you want to make that very quick. If not, we do have 5 minutes coming back to the Liberals. And Mr. Carr, you can just kind of prompt Mr. Weston again. Or very quickly, Mr. Weston.
To say there are meaningful impacts, that we are managing, throughout the value chain on a, call it, weekly basis.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Parent, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weston, I'm trying to understand all of this. Earlier you said that the best possible way to proceed would be for everybody to sign on to the code. And then you said that you were ejected, or rather excluded, from the steering committee and from the working group. According to what I've found out, you just weren't there. Has your company ever participated in the committees that are elaborating the code? Yes or no?
Well, certainly we have a team, 2 particular executives, 3 actually, who have been actively involved in discussions about the code. All I've said was that we were not on the working committee. We have had the opportunity to provide our feedback, and that feedback, was not accepted.
Donc, la réponse est non. Vous n'avez pas été au comité de...
So the answer is no, you were not at the working group nor at the steering committee. Earlier, you mentioned that since you have a chain that has rebates, you can't get involved. But Metro is ready to get involved, even though they have a grocery store that is cheaper, which is Super C. How do you justify that?
I've never said that we couldn't get involved. I've just said there are 4 elements of the code and the way that it's drafted, that we believe should be adjusted. And we have put forward what we consider to be very reasonable solutions, that we think can achieve the best of both worlds. All we're asking for is the ability to engage in that discussion in a constructive way.
Merci. Quand on s'était vu là, au mois de mars...
When you were here in March, I asked all 5 company CEOs to provide the profit numbers. All 5 said they can't because they are in competition with one another. So I asked all 5 if they would commit to providing that information to the Competition Bureau. I thought I understood that all 5 had agreed. Unfortunately, what we've seen, or what the Competition Bureau has brought back to us, is that it's been challenging to get those numbers. Can you tell us if Loblaws provided those numbers that were asked for by the Competition Bureau?
Yes, we provided it before this committee, 6 months ago, and so, yeah, we've been fully supportive of what they've asked for and given them everything that we could.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weston, the Code of Conduct Industry Group's response to your company was pretty scathing. They said that contrary to your claims, there was no evidence to suggest the code will either raise food prices or negatively impact the ability of retailers to meet consumer demand. And they said, if anything, all the available evidence actually shows that it will curb grocery price inflation. I'm just wondering, is your apprehension about the code more due to the fact that you think it's going to actually hurt Loblaw's bottom line instead of negatively impacting consumers? Because they've kind of laid out a fairly substantial case here to refute everything that you've said so far.
Yeah, I guess it's we have data, they have data. Our data is pretty compelling on this front, and we have laid it out in very specific terms. I don't believe that others have done it in quite the same way. And so, we believe our data is right. It's, it takes a little bit of courage, to stand in the way of something like this. And as I said, we're not trying to stop it. We're just trying to find ways to modify it, to reduce risk. I've had outreach from multiple manufacturers who have said explicitly, that they applaud the courage and that they agree that this code has the potential to increase food prices.
Thank you. And I just want to go back to my earlier intervention with you on food bank usage. I've asked this question to Mr. Medline, to Mr. Gabbera. Just the fact that, we do have firm evidence that many of your employees are struggling to make ends meet, and some are using food banks. And I think that it's very relevant when we're discussing food price inflation to also look at the examples that various companies are setting. So for this company, do you have a number or any interest as a CEO of the number of your employees that are actually having to access a food bank? Because this directly speaks to your ability to pay a living wage.
So food prices are the most important reason that we're here today, and I can tell you that Loblaw believes wholeheartedly in fair pay. We offer some of the most competitive wages in the industry. The fact remains that a large portion of our colleague base is part-time, and the reason they're part-time is because shoppers don't shop all the way throughout the day. They shop in the evening and they shop on the weekends. And so we need to have people working in the evenings and working on weekends. They need to be part-time shifts, part-time jobs. Part-time jobs, tend to have wage rates that are closer to minimum wage. As you know, we have a minimum wage system in across the provinces that is now is indexed to inflation. Since 2019, minimum wage has increased over 20%, and our pay in our unionized labor force, which is the substantive portion of our employees, has increased commensurately, with that minimum wage increase. And so, look, there's always opportunity, but we need to make sure that we're a productive and efficient, organization. And we've got to do it while making sure that we're paying absolutely the right wages for the industry. If you took our average wage as an enterprise, it's over $19 an hour, and that is regarded as a general, statement as in line with a living wage.
Thank you, Mr. Weston. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Now, colleagues, we're getting close to time, but Mr. Weston has taken his time to be here. I don't want to utilize or not use the full time, so we can extend for 15 minutes, and I'm going to. So, Ms. Rood, you go ahead. Then we have Ms. Taylor-Roy, and I'll have a few questions for Mr. Weston at the end. Go ahead, Ms. Rood. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Weston, for actually being here in person. It's nice to have you sitting at the table to talk to one-on-one. On the fines and fees, just to clarify my colleague's point, could you table the total for 2023 of the fines and fees paid? Just going to throw that out there. Now, earlier you talked about front-of-pack labeling and how it's going to cost $8 billion, and you also said that the government's new P2 plastics ban on food packaging will cost $6 billion. Will that cost be passed on to consumers and increase the price of food? Will it lead to food waste and impact food availability?
So I don't think I said that that front-of-pack labeling would cost $8 billion. I don't have a number for what that would cost. On the P2, it's $6 billion. And yes, all of these costs, are cost pressures that are likely to end up, being paid by consumers. And I would just remind the committee again that the reason for that is that if you have an increase on 78 or 80% of your cost of good, of your cost of your business model, and your profit is 2% or 3%, then we are forced into a situation where we have to pass through a lot of these cost increases.
So ultimately, consumers will pay more for fresh food if this plastics ban were to go ahead.
I believe so, yes.
Do you, in your opinion, the imposed timeline that the Liberal government has on this plastic ban, is it a realistic goal?
So Loblaw, as I mentioned before, leads the way in terms of plastic packaging reduction, and we work with a lot of manufacturers on innovation in this space. We think it will be very, very difficult to achieve the current timelines as laid out.
The government has threatened grocers with an excess profits tax if food prices don't stabilize by the beginning of 2024. And today's food prices report says that food inflation won't stabilize and an average family will pay $700 more next year. Will a grocer tax lower food prices for Canadians?
No, I don't believe that it will.
Thank you. When you were here last spring before this committee, I did bring to your attention some of the unfair practices and fines that your company was charging our farmers and producers specifically. And at that time, you said you would review those practices. So I'm just wondering, has your company made any changes into the way you're treating farmers and small suppliers?
Well, we certainly have. The introduction of the small supplier program is probably the most public, indication of that. The feedback that we've received from small suppliers and manufacturers has been extremely positive, and we're continuing to look for ways to do that. And we are in the midst of a review of our compliance charges to make sure that they are fair and justifiable. And this is why I know that our fees are down, nearly 50% this year, I think is the number. And we apply very transparent, and stringent, standards in terms of when those charges apply. I think we believe there's an opportunity to provide more transparency on this, so that manufacturers understand, so that they don't come as a surprise. And we think it's the surprise, that is the biggest issue here, and that if we can resolve that, a lot of this frustration will likely go away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to cede the rest of my time to Mr. Lahou.
Merci, Madame Rood.
Thank you, Ms. Rood. Mr. Weston, I will continue in the same line of questioning as Ms. Rood. Right now, we are looking at $5 billion that were paid in fines by various suppliers. Can you explain the following? How do you determine the terms between yourself and the suppliers? The future of the code of conduct would have a very important impact on that, because $5 billion, that's a lot of money. So how are you setting those penalties? Can we see the models that you're using?
I'll certainly take that away, it might very well be helpful to share some of that. So I don't know where the $5 billion number comes from in terms of this. Is certainly not our number. And as I've said before, in terms of our compliance charges, they are down substantially over the last couple of years. And, as vendor service levels continue to improve, we expect that number to continue to decline.
Thank you, Mr. Weston. Thank you, Mr.
Merci.
Liu. Ms. Taylor-Roy, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Weston, for being here in person again. Appreciate it. And there's so many questions I could ask you. But one of the things I want to talk about is the measures that our government is taking to address long-term issues in our country. Things around, for example, the P2 plastics. And obviously fighting climate change, as you've mentioned, increased cost of groceries has been driven a great deal. In fact, we heard last time that one of the stores expects orange juice to go up by 38% because of the climate impacts on crops in different countries. And I know it's the job of business to focus on short-term profit and shareholder value. It's the job of government to think about larger issues and not necessarily the short term. So in the Environment Committee, on which I sit right now, we are studying clean water. And there's a lot of concern about microplastics in the water and the effect of that on human health. Of course, that has a huge impact on healthcare costs, on long term. And I appreciate the fact that you are working on solutions to this as a major, user of plastics. I'm wondering if, we have to balance putting in ambitious goals to kind of motivate people and ask people to make changes versus looking at the impacts on companies. So you said that you didn't think the timeline of 2.5 years was reasonable to come up with a solution. You've been working on this for a while. The industry has known about our ambition, our desire to protect Canadians' health by making these changes. Why do you think there have not been a solution, and when do you see that coming?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I would say, we are a family business. Our family's been in this business for 4 generations, so we think about the long term as well. It's why we're so ambitious in our net zero carbon targets. It's why I co-chair a global effort for the retailers and manufacturing industry to find ways to reduce plastic waste across the industry. We have over $2 trillion worth of sales in manufacturing and retail committed, to what we call the golden design rules for reducing plastic waste. We're big advocates of extended producer responsibility, which has been innovated here in Canada. And we believe that system design change is ultimately going to lead to the most effective results. And so we have to work really closely with the Environmental Ministry at the provincial level and the federal level to make sure that we are putting in policies that are achievable and that are actually going to deliver a constructive benefit. And this P2 has great ambition, and it's a great ambition, but it's not easy to execute. In fact, I think I would say it's impossible to execute in this time frame. And so, how much longer do we need? I don't know the answer, but I can tell you this: I'm really encouraged by the level of momentum that the industry has globally on this subject, and so I think we're going to get it.
Well, I'd love to hear if you can find out from people working on this in your company some feedback on what's being done exactly and when you think it is. The other area I wanted to talk about was the price on pollution program. As you've said, you're committed to a net zero carbon target. Clearly, you believe there's a climate crisis, as we do. And the price on pollution is often referred by the opposition as the reason for high food prices. However, there's many countries where there is no price on pollution and food prices are higher than here, or food inflation has been higher. This is a market-based approach. With our climate action incentive rebate we give to Canadians, most Canadians get back more than they pay. In fact, the most recent study showed that 93% of households making under $50,000 get back more than they pay. And it is an efficient way to try and address emissions, as you're doing in your net zero target. What are your opinions on programs such as this that we're trying to change consumer behavior, where there are alternatives, and using a tool like this, a market-based tool, to fight climate change?
In about 30 seconds, Mr. Weston.
Yes, I absolutely think that market-based solutions are an essential part of how to change, economic behavior and consumer behavior over time. We're in a difficult spot, because we're now trying to manage the cost of living, against long-term incentives to change behavior. And I think we have to continue to work on ways to do both.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor-Roy. Mr. Weston, I'll exercise just a few minutes for a few questions. I'll try to move as quickly as possible. Look, part of your opening statement was about the code of conduct not necessarily driving grocery prices down. I would agree with you on that we have to be very transparent about what the code does and doesn't do. We can't be telling Canadians that a grocery code of conduct is going to result in huge drop in prices, but this committee also has an obligation to the supply chain and to the farmers that actually provide the products into your stores. And you talked about your concern about how the prices would go up. I'm looking at a graph from Dr. Charlebois, who laid out price increases over 10 years in countries that had a code versus those that didn't. I take notice that there's a lot that goes into food price. But I want to dig into what you provided this committee specifically. You mentioned at clause 2.5, and I want to read it for the benefit of everyone. For the purposes of the code, an agreement is anything that defines the material elements of a relationship between commercial parties. They can include contracts, invoices, purchase orders, bills of lading, emails, and other forms of mutually agreed material that memorializes an understanding between the parties. Now, I practice law for a short period of time. I might not have the experience of some of your corporate lawyers at Loblaws, but if you have an email or a bill of lading or some type of payment, then surely there would have been some discussion about the price of which the product was going to be charged. I can appreciate it wouldn't be an ironclad commercial agreement that you might be seeking, but I think about a farmer in my own riding that might be providing produce for you. One of your agents at Loblaws says, look, we'll buy tomatoes at X amount. Would that not, that is a contract. So what is it specifically? Because you talk about negotiating in good faith. Those are examples of at least commercial agreement between your company and a supplier. Why is that not good enough for you? Like, why is that problematic, that code specifically? Because you talk about negotiating in good faith. What explicitly don't, if there was an invoice or a purchase order, there would have been some conversation about what the terms would be, maybe not as exclusive or as high-end as a big manufacturer, food manufacturer, but why is that so problematic for you?
The issue is the imbalance. I think our view is that if there's an expectation that a retailer enters into a set of detailed contract terms, that a manufacturer should have the same responsibility, so that we all have the same piece of paper that says these are the terms that we've agreed and this is the basis on which we should conduct business. And the way that the code reads in the specific language from our perspective is that it holds the retailer to a higher standard than the manufacturer. And as a result, those manufacturers can come and change the cost or refuse to accept, changes in business terms, and we are unable to do the same thing. So all we've asked for is for us to balance that equation out, so that both sides, are responsible for adhering to the same set of standards.
And you have here, it's only fair that a supplier should be able to enjoy the benefits of the code only if it has written into a written agreement with a retailer setting out the commercial terms. But isn't that the whole idea of the code, Mr. Weston, that we actually provide some fundamentals? Because I can appreciate when you're negotiating with Pepsi, those are two different conversations. But the idea of the code here, and you admitted it in your own testimony, for smaller food manufacturers or suppliers directly, this is about creating some transparency and some elements that they can hold on to. So I guess I'll ask the question, is there an idea that you could actually have larger manufacturers not be necessarily subject to this, and this would apply for smaller food processors? Like what is it? Because I can appreciate if you're negotiating with Pepsi, that relationship is different than if you're negotiating with a farmer in my riding. Why is it that if they're just simply trying to lay out principles that you would negotiate with, somehow that's contravention to the business practices that would be expected in this country?
Yeah, so as we've said before, the principles, in the code, particularly around your point, which is, how do we improve the relationship between retailers and manufacturers, are absolutely sound. Our concern is in the drafting itself that it creates these vulnerabilities that create this risk. And you're absolutely right. We see the biggest risk here, in the way that the code is drafted, in manufacturers who are very, very much bigger, than the Canadian retailers, exploiting the way that it's drafted at the expense of the Canadian consumer.
Last thing I'll ask just very quickly is around, you mentioned about filling orders, and you go out to consumers and say, look, we're going to have this product at this price, and then you said food manufacturers not providing the product that you expected. We've heard instances, both privately and I think even before this committee, of the idea that there would be significant fines if someone only provided 98.5% of the expected product delivery. What in your mind is a reasonable tension there? If you ask for 50,000 units of a certain product and they come in at 98.5%, is it reasonable that a food retailer should be able to impose that? I appreciate you want certainty. I do understand that, Mr. Weston, but there are circumstances where that can actually add to the food costs through the entire supply chain and then get passed on to consumers. So what is a reasonableness? Because when I look at the actual provision, there's the talk that there's a reasonableness clause in here such that you couldn't impose unless they really significantly did not meet their order in a way that would be egregious under commercial terms.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Reasonableness, is one of the areas that we are focused on in terms of opportunities to enhance the code. I think our perspective is that if we can modify it in such a way that, that the necessary practices that allow the retailer, in our case, let's say as an example, to hold a manufacturer accountable, remains in position. And there are reasonableness thresholds that we can all sort of agree to. That if they break beyond that reasonableness threshold, or they're unjustified in some way, then there can be some consequence or some form of resolution. So you're talking exactly about this, about what we're talking about, and I think maybe there's just a disagreement about whether the drafting, as it currently stands, actually accommodates, this reasonableness factor the way it needs to.
Would you like to provide this committee any sense of what that threshold would be for you, whether or not for large food manufacturers or smaller? Is that 95%? Is it 90%? Like, do you have any thoughts in your mind, or have you provided anything into the government on that?
It's a little bit complicated because that calculation is done on a 12-week average, not on sort of an individual moment in time. So 98% in that context suggests that there's absolutely no room for error, whereas in fact, there is. And remember, these are quantities that are agreed, up front. So if somebody says, oh, I agree to give you this, 100 products, and you don't give that 100 products, that is a challenge. And so when you're making exceptions, 60% of the time, I think it suggests reasonableness on the part of the retailer. But it also may suggest that, okay, if we're having that many exceptions, maybe the algorithm, has an opportunity to be improved, and that's something that we're working on right now.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for indulging a few lines of questions. Thank you to our translators for extending a little bit. And thank you, Mr. Weston, for being here. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Colleagues, we will be back on Monday. We have Mr. Laflèche coming from Metro for the first hour, and then we have CPMA, Association Maraîcher du Québec, and we have the Centre for the Future of Work. That'll be what we do on Monday. Enjoy your weekend, colleagues.